As fighter jets circled the Collins family homestead at dawn, no one suspected that the unassuming farmer's wife, who had pulled an injured pilot from burning wreckage hours earlier, harbored secrets from a classified past so explosive that their revelation would force an entire branch of the armed forces to acknowledge a decades-old cover-up and rewrite the history of one of America's most controversial military operations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn sky over Hartland County had been clear and star-filled when the thunderous roar of a military aircraft in distress shattered the night's tranquility. Margaret Collins had been alone in the farmhouse, her husband Robert away at an agricultural conference in Des Moines, when the distinctive sound of an engine failure, followed by the sickening impact of a crash, sent her running for the door. The glow of flames illuminated the northern edge of their wheat field, still awaiting harvest. Without hesitation, she grabbed the emergency kit kept by the door, a farmer's necessity in remote Wilder Creek, and sprinted across the uneven ground toward the wreckage. The scene that greeted her was both chaotic and eerily contained. A sleek, angular aircraft, unlike anything commonly seen in civilian news reports, lay partially embedded in the soft earth, one wing completely sheared off, flames licking at the fuselage. Despite the fire, Margaret approached without hesitation. Later, witnesses would marvel at her composure, her methodical assessment of the situation, her apparent lack of fear as she navigated the hazardous debris field. But in that moment, she was focused solely on reaching the pilot, visible through the fractured canopy, moving weakly in the cockpit. "I found him partially conscious, struggling with his harness," Margaret would later explain to investigators with remarkable precision. The fire was spreading toward the fuel cells. There was no time for protocol or second-guessing. Somehow, and the somehow would become a critical question in the days that followed, this 58-year-old farmer's wife managed to force open the damaged canopy, release the complicated harness system, and drag the injured pilot clear of the wreckage moments before secondary explosions consumed what remained of the aircraft. By the time local volunteer firefighters and sheriff's deputies arrived 20 minutes later, Margaret had the pilot stabilized in the shelter of an equipment shed, his wounds dressed with surprising expertise, an IV line established from supplies in her unusually comprehensive medical kit. The pilot, dressed in a flight suit devoid of standard insignia or identification, drifted between consciousness and unconsciousness. The aircraft itself had been reduced to unrecognizable burning wreckage. "Ma'am, you need to step away now," instructed Sheriff Dale Hoskins upon arrival, a man who had known Margaret for the 15 years she and Robert had owned the farm. "We've got medical incoming and the military has been notified." "He needs a blood transfusion," Margaret responded, with unexpected authority. "He's type O negative. The impact caused internal bleeding, possible splenic rupture. The burns are superficial, but there's a pneumothorax developing in the left lung. Tell the incoming medical team to be prepared." The sheriff's bewildered expression said everything. This was not the Margaret Collins known to the community, the quiet woman who sold prize-winning preserves at the county fair, who taught Sunday school at Wilder Creek Presbyterian, who seemed content with the rhythms of farm life and her book club. "Margaret," Sheriff Hoskins said slowly, "how could you possibly know all that?" Her answer was interrupted by the distinctive sound of military helicopters approaching, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. Margaret's expression changed then, a subtle shift that the sheriff would later struggle to describe too. "Investigators, not fear exactly, something more complex, recognition perhaps, or resignation." "They're here sooner than I expected," she said quietly, more to herself than to Hoskins. Then, with sudden urgency, "Dale, listen carefully. This man isn't just any pilot, and that wasn't just any aircraft. Before they land, you need to understand," but it was too late. 3 Black Hawk helicopters descended into the adjacent field, kicking up swirling clouds of wheat chaff and dust. Within moments, the area was swarming with military personnel. In unmarked tactical gear, their movements precise and coordinated. A perimeter was established with remarkable speed. Equipment appeared. Communication systems were deployed. The pilot was whisked into one helicopter, which immediately departed. Sheriff Hoskins found himself politely but firmly escorted to the perimeter, his jurisdiction effectively suspended without explanation. Local emergency responders were thanked for their service and dismissed. Roads leading to the Collins farm were blocked by military vehicles that had seemingly materialized from nowhere. Only Margaret remained inside the perimeter, engaged in intense conversation with a silver-haired man whose bearing suggested considerable authority. The discussion appeared neither friendly nor hostile, but notably, Margaret seemed to be speaking as an equal, not as a civilian confronted by military command. As dawn approached, residents of Wilder Creek awakened to an extraordinary sight. Fighter jets circling the Collins homestead in a precise pattern, while ground forces established what could only be described as a military occupation of the farm. Rumors spread quickly through the community. Must be some experimental aircraft that went down, suggested Pete Larson at the town diner. Probably something to do with the missile silos up north, offered Diane Wheeler, the high school principal. I heard it was a UFO, whispered 13-year-old Tyler Schmidt, earning an eye roll from the adults. None suspected the truth, that the key to understanding the military's overwhelming response lay not with the aircraft or the injured pilot, but with Margaret Collins herself. By mid-morning, national media had caught wind of the story. Initial reports described only a military aircraft incident on private property. Pentagon spokespersons offered minimal comment, citing operational security. Local officials found themselves sidelined, their questions unanswered. Inside the military cordon, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, facing the silver-haired man now identified as General James Harrington, Director of Special Operations Command. Between them lay a file marked with the highest classification level. Margaret's reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed documents with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to such material. "After all these years," Harrington said, breaking a lengthy silence, "I never expected it would be a crashed prototype that brought you back onto our radar, Margaret. Or should I call you Major Roberts?" Margaret removed her glasses, fixing the general with a steady gaze. "Margaret Collins has been my name for 15 years, General. Sarah Roberts hasn't existed since 2008. "And yet," Harrington replied, tapping, "the file, when faced with a downed pilot and a burning aircraft containing classified technology, Sarah Roberts is exactly who showed up in that field last night. The medical assessment, the emergency protocols, the recognition of the aircraft type. You haven't lost your touch, Major." "Former Major," Margaret corrected firmly. "I left that life behind for good reasons. Reasons that, judging by your presence here, haven't been fully addressed." The general's expression hardened. "That pilot was carrying detailed information about Project Helix, the same project that I was told had been permanently discontinued," Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp. "The same project I testified should never have been approved. In the first place, the same project that cost the lives of 17 of my colleagues." Outside, the fighter jets continued their vigilant circles, their presence ensuring both security and silence around whatever had truly happened on the Collins farm. But as the morning progressed, it was becoming increasingly clear to those in Margaret's kitchen that keeping this situation contained might prove impossible. "We need your cooperation, Margaret," General Harrington said finally. "One last mission." "What you need," Margaret replied, "is accountability, and after 15 years of silence, I think it's finally time." As she spoke, she reached beneath the kitchen counter and retrieved a weathered metal box, the kind used for storing seed catalogs and farming documents. But what she removed from within was something else entirely: a data drive and a sealed envelope with the presidential seal. I wasn't just a pilot, General. I was insurance. The implications of those words, and what followed, would reverberate through the highest levels of military command by nightfall. As the military perimeter tightened around the Collins farm, the residents of Wilder Creek struggled to reconcile the unfolding drama with their understanding of Margaret Collins. For 15 years, she had been a fixture in their community, reliable, unassuming, competent, but never remarkable. Margaret and her husband, Robert, had arrived in 2008, purchasing the struggling Jensen property when land prices had bottomed out during the recession. The community had initially viewed them with the cautious assessment typical of rural areas. Newcomers were always subject to quiet scrutiny before acceptance. But the Collins couple had integrated seamlessly, Robert with his innovative farming techniques and Margaret with her steady community involvement. Margaret always seemed content with the background, reflected Evelyn Porter, who had worked alongside her at the church food bank for over a decade. She never sought attention, never volunteered personal stories. I realize now she never actually talked about her life before Wilder Creek. This absence of personal history hadn't seemed suspicious in a community that valued privacy and self-sufficiency. Margaret was simply regarded as practical and present-focused, a woman who could be counted on to organize the harvest festival with calm efficiency, who taught children with patient attention, who maintained her garden with methodical care. 58, Margaret carried herself with the physical confidence of someone accustomed to demanding work. Her hands showed the calluses of farm labor, her face the weathering of someone who spent long hours outdoors. Her grey-streaked brown hair was typically pulled back in a practical bun, her clothing chosen for utility rather than style. Nothing about her appearance hinted at a military background or a life spent in classified operations. She could calculate crop yields faster than my calculator, Robert Williams at the grain elevator recalled. And she never got flustered, even during that flood in 2014, when everyone else was panicking, steady as they come. This steadiness had been Margaret's defining characteristic until the night she pulled a pilot from burning wreckage with the expertise of a combat veteran. Inside the military cordon, a different picture of Margaret Collins was emerging through rapid-fire intelligence briefings and hastily assembled dossiers. Computer screens in a mobile command center displayed personnel files and operation reports that had been classified at the highest levels. The woman these files described, Major Sarah Roberts, bore little superficial resemblance to the farmers. Wife of Wilder Creek, Major Roberts had been one of the most decorated female pilots in the history of the Air Force Special Operations Command. Her background included advanced degrees in aeronautical engineering and medicine. Her service record featured deployments to classified locations, participation in operations whose very names remained redacted decades later, and commendations signed by 3 different presidents. Most significantly, Major Roberts had been the lead test pilot for Project Helix, until she wasn't. Her disappearance in 2008 coincided with the project's official termination, a military intelligence officer explained to General Harrington as they walked the perimeter of the farm. The timing wasn't considered suspicious at the time because her exit was properly documented. Honorable discharge, complete paperwork, everything by the book. Except it wasn't, Harrington replied grimly. The paperwork was flawless because she knew exactly how to create it. She didn't just leave the program, she vanished herself from the system. But why, sir? And how did she end up here of all places? The general's gaze swept across the farmland that had hidden one of their most valuable operatives for 15 years. That's what we need to find out before she decides to share whatever's on that drive with the world. Inside the farmhouse, Margaret moved with measured precision, ignoring the surveillance equipment now visibly installed in her home. She prepared coffee in a metal percolator, avoiding the electric coffee maker now undoubtedly bugged, and placed 2 mugs on the kitchen table. Her movements betrayed years of tactical awareness, identifying sight lines and positioning herself with her back to walls, never directly in front of windows. "You have questions," she said to the general as he returned from his perimeter check. "I have conditions." Harrington took the offered coffee with a raised eyebrow. "You're not exactly in a position to make demands, Major." "On the contrary," Margaret replied evenly, "I'm in precisely that position. You have a prototype aircraft, down with technology that officially doesn't exist. You have a pilot who was flying a mission that officially wasn't authorized. And you have me, a woman who officially died in a training accident 15 years ago, yet somehow ended up married to a farmer in Iowa with enough documentation to sink 3 administrations." She sipped her coffee, her eyes never leaving the general's. "So yes, General Harrington, I have conditions." The impasse might have continued indefinitely, if not for the arrival of a sleek government SUV that passed through the military checkpoint with minimal scrutiny. The vehicle parked directly before the farmhouse, and from it emerged a woman whose appearance caused even the stoic General Harrington to straighten his posture. "Director Chen," he acknowledged as she entered without knocking. Catherine Chen, Director of National Intelligence, nodded curtly to Harrington before turning her full attention to Margaret. The 2 women studied each other with the careful assessment of chess masters calculating moves and counter-moves. "Sarah," Chen said finally, "it's been a long time." "Kate," Margaret responded with the faintest hint of a smile. "Still cleaning up messes for presidents? Still causing them for the military?" The tension in the room shifted subtly, not diminishing, but transforming into something more complex. These were not strangers, nor simply former colleagues. There was history here, unspoken, but palpable. "I assume you're here about Project Helix," Margaret said, gesturing for Chen to join them at the table. "I'm here about what's on that drive," Chen corrected, remaining standing, "and about preventing another national security disaster." Margaret's expression hardened. "The disaster already happened, Kate. 17 dead, an entire village wiped off the map. Testifying before Congress just to have every word classified and every recommendation ignored. That was the disaster. You took classified materials when you disappeared," Chen countered. "That's treason." "I took insurance," Margaret replied calmly. "And judging by the prototype that crashed in my field last night, I was right to do so. They never shut the program down, did they? Despite the casualties, despite the ethics committee, despite my testimony, they just renamed it and continued." The silence that followed confirmed her suspicion more clearly than words could have. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this verification of her worst fears. "Then it's time," she said softly, almost to herself. When she opened her eyes again, they held a resolve that made both Chen and Harrington shift uncomfortably. Time for the truth, the whole truth. Outside, the fighter jets continued their vigil over the unassuming farmhouse. But inside, the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Margaret Collins, the quiet, reliable farmer's wife, was receding. In her place stood Major Sarah Roberts, a woman who had spent 15 years preparing for this exact moment. "You should call the president," she advised Chen. "He'll want to be briefed before this goes public." She held up the drive. "Because make no mistake, either you address this officially or I will." The taciturn farmer's wife who had sold jam at the county fair was nowhere to be seen. The woman who now faced down the highest levels of military and intelligence authority spoke with the unshakable confidence of someone who had calculated every scenario and prepared for every contingency. "You have 4 hours," she informed them. "Then I start making calls." As Chen stepped outside to make a secure call, Harrington remained, studying Margaret with a mixture of professional respect and personal wariness. "The pilot will recover," he said, offering an olive branch of information. "Lieutenant Sawyer, 29 years old, no family. Not his real name," Margaret observed, "and not his real age either. Helix pilots are recruited much younger, 15 or 16, if you're still following the original protocols." Harrington's expression confirmed her assessment. "You trained him?" Margaret realized, the pieces falling into place. "Just like Colonel Westfield trained me, the cycle continues." For the first time, Harrington's composure wavered. "You can't possibly think this is the same program. We've made modifications, implemented safeguards." "Safeguards?" Margaret laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Is that what you call sending children into experimental aircraft with neurological implants that burn out their brains by 30? Is that what you call weaponizing human beings who can't legally vote?" She crossed to a simple oak cabinet, removing a framed photograph of herself and her husband Robert at a state fair, their arms around each other, smiling in the summer sun. She turned it over, removing the backing to reveal a hidden compartment containing a small key. "Project Helix wasn't just about advanced aircraft," she continued, using the key to unlock a concealed safe beneath the floorboards. "It was about creating pilots whose neural patterns could interface directly with the navigation systems, pilots whose reaction times were artificially enhanced, pilots who could endure G-forces that would kill ordinary humans." From the safe, she withdrew a metallic object approximately the size of a silver dollar, its surface etched with circuitry patterns so fine they appeared as shimmering texture. "This is what you put in our brains," she said, holding it up to the light. "Neural interface technology derived from classified research that even Congress wasn't informed about. 17 of my colleagues died when the first-generation interfaces malfunctioned. Their minds literally burned out." Harrington stared at the device, his face ashen. "How did you remove mine?" Margaret finished. "With help from the one person who knew the program was morally unconscionable." She glanced toward the door, where Chen had exited. "Kate performed the surgery herself, removed the interface, helped me create my new identity, and gave me the files that documented everything. Then she stayed behind to ensure no one else would suffer the same fate." The revelation landed like a physical blow. "Chen was part of your disappearance?" "Kate's involvement is her story to tell," Margaret replied firmly. "What matters is that the program was supposed to end. All test subjects were supposed to be monitored for life, compensated for their service, and provided with proper medical care. Instead, you just rebranded and continued." She returned to the table, placing the neural interface carefully between them. "This is what crashed in my field last night. Not just an aircraft, but a pilot with next-generation interface technology. And I'm betting his neural patterns are already showing signs of degradation that your doctors are struggling to explain." The general's silence was confirmation enough. 4 hours, Margaret repeated, as Chen re-entered the room. "Either you bring the appropriate oversight committees here, or I take this story to the press with enough documentation to ensure it can't be buried again." Chen and Harrington exchanged glances laden with unspoken calculation. "The president is being briefed," Chen confirmed. "A delegation from the Intelligence Committee will arrive by helicopter within the hour." Margaret nodded, allowing herself the briefest moment of satisfaction. 15 years of patient waiting, of maintaining her cover identity, of being prepared for a moment she couldn't predict but knew would eventually come. All of it had led to this pivotal point. The unassuming farmer's wife had orchestrated one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in recent history, not from a headquarters with unlimited resources, but from a modest farmhouse in Iowa, armed with nothing but the truth and the patience to wait for the perfect moment to reveal it. As military helicopters ferrying members of the Senate Intelligence Committee approached the Collins farm, the standoff inside the modest farmhouse kitchen intensified. Margaret had positioned herself strategically at the table, the data drive containing 15 years of evidence placed deliberately before her, the neural interface device alongside it. The tableau was carefully arranged, a visual reminder of both the technological horror at the heart of Project Helix and the documentation that could expose it to the world. "I need to know what you're planning, Sarah," Director Chen said, using Margaret's former name with deliberate emphasis. "Before those senators land, before this situation escalates beyond containment, what exactly do you want?" Margaret's calm expression never wavered. Justice for the 17 pilots who died, medical care for all surviving test subjects, full disclosure to appropriate oversight committees, and permanent termination of the neural interface program, not rebranding, not relocating, not continuing under another classification level. Actual termination. "You're asking for the dismantling of a multi-billion-dollar defense initiative," General Harrington interjected. "Technology that provides critical tactical advantages in contested airspace. The national security implications alone—" "Don't," Margaret cut him off, her voice hardening for the first time. "Don't hide behind national security when what you're really protecting is budget allocations and career advancement. I've read every document on that drive. I know exactly which admirals and generals tied their stars to Project Helix. I know which defense contractors made billions developing technology they knew was killing pilots. I know which congressional staffers were paid to look the other way." The precision of her knowledge visibly unsettled Harrington. He exchanged glances with Chen, who subtly shook her head, a warning not to underestimate the woman before them. "What you've done could be considered espionage," Harrington tried, shifting to legal threats. "Taking classified material, maintaining it outside secure channels for 15 years. "I prefer to think of it as whistleblowing," Margaret countered. "But if you want to discuss legal definitions, let's talk about illegal human experimentation. Let's talk about recruiting minors for classified military programs without parental consent. Let's talk about falsifying death certificates for test subjects whose brains were literally cooked by your neural interfaces." She leaned forward, her farmer's posture giving way entirely to the commanding presence of a senior military officer. "I'm not some contractor who copied files for profit, General. I was the lead test pilot for Project Helix. I was the first survivor of a neural interface implantation. Everything on this drive relates directly to operations I personally participated in or commanded. Under the Military Whistleblower Protection Act, I had both the right and the duty to report illegal activities." "Then why disappear?" Chen asked quietly. "Why not work through official channels?" Margaret's gaze shifted to the Director of National Intelligence, and something passed between the two women, a shared memory perhaps, or an unspoken understanding. "You know why, Kate. You were there when I tried. 3 separate Inspector General reports buried. Congressional testimony classified at the highest levels. 2 colleagues who supported my claims died in accidents within weeks. Official channels were compromised." She turned back to Harrington. "So I created my own channel. I took the evidence, created a secure identity that not even the NSA could penetrate, and waited for the inevitable moment when Project Helix would reveal itself again. I just never expected it would crash land in my wheat field." From outside came the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters, the Congressional delegation arriving. Margaret checked her watch. 2 hours and 17 minutes before my deadline. Let's see if elected oversight works better than military chain of command." As military aides rushed to prepare for the arriving officials, Harrington made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "What about your husband?" he asked, his tone suggesting he'd found a vulnerability. "Robert Collins thinks he's married to a farmer's wife, not a military whistleblower with classified material hidden in their home." How will he react when he discovers his entire marriage has been built on deception? For the first time, Margaret's composure flickered, a momentary tightening around her eyes, quickly controlled but noticed by both Chen and Harrington. "Robert knows exactly who I am," she replied, her voice quieter but no less firm. "He's known from the beginning." Now it was Harrington's turn to look shocked. "That's not possible. Our background checks were thorough but incomplete," Margaret finished for him. "Robert Collins isn't just my husband. He was Dr. Robert Vance, Chief Medical Ethics Officer for Project Helix, until 2008, when he resigned in protest over the continued use of neural interfaces, despite documented fatal side effects." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Harrington sank into a chair, reassessing 15 years of assumed security protocols. "You've been living with one of our chief medical researchers? A man with level 8 clearance for advanced neural technology? A man who took the same oath I did," Margaret corrected. "To defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. When the chain of command fails to uphold ethical and legal standards, that oath doesn't become invalid. It becomes more important." The distinctive sound of a car engine approaching. The perimeter drew their attention. Through the kitchen window, Margaret watched as military personnel stopped a battered pickup truck at the checkpoint. Even from a distance, she recognized her husband's tall frame as he emerged from the vehicle, presenting identification to the guards. After a brief consultation with higher authorities via radio, the soldiers allowed him through. "Perfect timing," Margaret noted. "Now the Congressional delegation can hear from both Project Helix's lead test pilot and its chief medical ethics officer. I suggest you prepare them for what they're about to learn." Outside, the first helicopter touched down. In the adjacent field, men and women in business attire emerged, escorted by military personnel across the farmyard. Robert's truck pulled up to the house just as they approached. For a moment, husband and wife locked eyes across the distance, a silent communication passing between them before Robert turned to greet the arriving officials with the casual confidence of a man well accustomed to high-level briefings. Inside the farmhouse, Margaret watched through the window, her posture revealing none of the emotion churning beneath her controlled exterior. 15 years of waiting, of maintaining cover, of building a life that was both genuine in its connections and false in its foundations. All of it had led to this moment. "You planned for this," Chen realized, studying Margaret's face. "Not the crash specifically, but for the moment when Helix would resurface. You positioned yourself here, in this remote location, knowing that whatever form the confrontation took, you'd have the advantage of home ground." Margaret nodded almost imperceptibly. "Strategic positioning, something they taught us in advanced tactical training. Choose the battlefield that provides maximum advantage and minimum vulnerability." "A family farm in Iowa," Harrington muttered. "Hiding in plain sight." "Not hiding," Margaret corrected. "Waiting." As the delegation entered the farmhouse, the modest kitchen suddenly crowded with senators, military officers, and intelligence officials. Margaret and Robert stood side by side, their farmer's attire and weathered hands creating a striking visual contrast with the suits and polished appearance of the government officials. Yet something in their bearing, the way they occupied the space with quiet confidence, made it immediately clear to everyone present that these were not ordinary civilians caught in extraordinary circumstances. Senator Eleanor Whitman, chair of the Intelligence Committee, stepped forward. "Major Roberts, Dr. Vance," she acknowledged, using their former titles. "I understand you have information regarding Project Helix that requires immediate attention." "We do, Senator," Margaret confirmed. "But first, I need your verbal confirmation that this meeting is being conducted under the protections of the Military Whistleblower Protection Act and that all participants understand that attempts to classify whistleblower testimony regarding illegal activities are themselves violations of federal law. The senator blinked, clearly not accustomed to being managed so efficiently, but nodded. So noted and confirmed. This committee is here to understand what appears to be a serious breach of oversight regarding classified military technology. Not a breach of oversight. Robert spoke for the first time, his deep voice carrying the same quiet authority as his wife's. A deliberate circumvention of it. He placed a medical bag on the table and removed a portable tablet. I've maintained medical records on 23 surviving Helix test subjects for 15 years. Neural degradation patterns, cognitive decline markers, mortality rates. The data conclusively demonstrates that continued use of neural interface technology constitutes knowing and deliberate harm to military personnel. Margaret placed her hand on the data drive. And I've documented the decision chain that allowed the program to continue despite these known risks. Every memo, every budget, allocation, every falsified report, every diverted oversight attempt, names, dates, signatures. My God, whispered one of the younger senators, clearly recognizing the gravity of what was being presented. Margaret met the committee chair's eyes directly. Senator Whitman, 15 years ago, I tried to stop this program through official channels and was silenced. Today, a young pilot nearly died in my field because those channels failed. I'm giving you and this committee the opportunity to demonstrate that civilian oversight of military operations isn't just a constitutional theory, but an operational reality. She gestured to the neural interface on the table. That device was surgically implanted in my brain for 3 years. It allowed me to fly experimental aircraft with unprecedented neural integration. It also caused seizures, memory loss, and would have eventually killed me if not for intervention. The young pilot who crashed last night has an advanced version of the same technology in his brain right now. While we're talking, it's degrading his neural pathways. He has months, maybe weeks, before permanent damage occurs. The kitchen had grown utterly silent as the impact of her words registered. What would you have us do? Senator Whitman asked finally. Exactly what this committee was created to do, Margaret answered. Provide oversight, demand accountability, protect the men and women who serve from those who would sacrifice them for technological advancement or career progression. She glanced at her watch, a deliberate reminder of her earlier deadline. You have 1 hour and 42 minutes to convince me that you'll take appropriate action. Otherwise, at noon, I release everything on this drive to selected journalists who have agreed to publish it unredacted and without delay. The line had been drawn. After 15 years of patient preparation, Margaret Collins, once Major Sarah Roberts, had orchestrated the ultimate confrontation between military secrecy and democratic oversight. In her modest farmhouse kitchen, surrounded by the trappings of her carefully constructed life, she had created a moment of truth from which there could be no retreat. And as the senators conferred in urgent whispers, as military officers shifted uncomfortably, as her husband moved to stand supportively at her side, the fighter jets continued their vigilant circles overhead. A reminder that while power might be debated in farmhouse kitchens, it was still ultimately enforced by those who controlled the skies. As the closed-door meeting in the Collins farmhouse extended into its second hour, the scene outside transformed dramatically. Additional military vehicles arrived, establishing a more robust perimeter that now extended half a mile in all directions. Communications equipment sprouted on the roof of the barn. A mobile command center hummed with activity beside the old silo. The fighter jets maintained their overhead vigil, joined occasionally by surveillance drones that hovered at the edges of the property. In Wilder Creek, tension mounted as the scale of military presence grew. Sheriff Hoskins found himself managing increasingly alarmed citizens with minimal information. National media vans clustered at the roadblocks, reporters broadcasting speculative updates against the backdrop of distant aircraft and the occasional glimpse of the Collins farmhouse. "This is no ordinary crash response," observed CNN's military correspondent. "The level of resources deployed suggests something far more significant than a training accident." Sources within the Pentagon refused to comment, but the presence of members of the Senate Intelligence Committee indicates this may involve classified technology or operations. Inside the command center, frustration mounted among military officials excluded from the farmhouse meeting. Colonel Drake, the operational commander for the containment effort, paced before screens displaying thermal imagery of the house. "We have a level 5 security breach in progress, and I'm ordered to stand down," he fumed to his executive officer. "A farm wife is dictating terms to United States senators while holding classified material that could compromise national security, and we're just maintaining a perimeter." "Orders from the Pentagon are clear, sir," his XO replied carefully. "No direct intervention unless authorized by General Harrington. The situation is being handled diplomatically." Drake snorted. "Diplomatic handling of blackmail. That's a new approach." In Washington, the crisis had reached the Oval Office. The president had been briefed on the rapidly developing situation, including the stunning revelation that 2 presumed retired Project Helix personnel had been living undetected for 15 years while accumulating evidence of program violations. "How the hell did we miss this?" the president demanded of his national security advisor. "We have a $1 trillion intelligence apparatus, and we couldn't track 2 people living openly in Iowa." "That's part of what makes this so concerning, Mr. President," the advisor replied. "Roberts, or Collins, wasn't just any operative. She was trained in our most advanced counterintelligence protocols. She knew exactly how to disappear within our own systems. And she had help from Director Chen," the president said flatly. "We don't know the extent of Director Chen's involvement yet, sir, but her presence at the farm without prior notification to the chain of command suggests some pre-existing connection." The president moved to the window, gazing out at the Washington Monument in the distance. "What's your assessment of the threat? If this information goes public, what's the damage?" "Catastrophic, sir. Project Helix represents billions in classified research. The neural interface technology has applications beyond military aviation, and the ethical implications of recruiting minors for experimental medical procedures would create a firestorm that could derail multiple defense initiatives. And if we meet their demands," the advisor hesitated, "we'd be setting a precedent for whistleblowers to dictate terms through extrajudicial means. But containing this internally would at least prevent foreign adversaries from accessing the technical specifications." The president checked his watch. "They've given us less than an hour before they release everything. Get me a secure line to Senator Whitman at the farm." Back in Iowa, the pressure inside the farmhouse kitchen intensified as Margaret and Robert methodically presented their evidence to the increasingly disturbed congressional delegation. Medical records displayed on Robert's tablet showed progressive neural degradation in former Helix pilots. Margaret's documentation revealed systematic efforts to conceal these effects from oversight committees. "This pilot," Robert explained, displaying brain scans labeled with yesterday's date, "shows early-stage deterioration consistent with second-generation interface toxicity. Within 6 months, he'll experience memory loss. Within a year, motor function impairment. Within 18 months, if the pattern holds true, total cognitive collapse." "And there are how many active pilots currently implanted with this technology?" Senator Whitman asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Based on the program parameters and budget allocations documented here," Margaret replied, scrolling through files on her data drive, "approximately 37. All recruited between the ages of 15 and 17, all officially listed in non-experimental training programs. Senator Whitman turned to General Harrington. "Is this accurate, General?" Harrington's military bearing remained intact, but tension showed around his eyes. "Project Helix is a classified program, Senator. I cannot discuss operational details in an unsecured location." "That's not an answer, General," Whitman countered sharply. "We're talking about American service members undergoing experimental brain procedures with documented fatal outcomes. Classification doesn't shield illegal activities from congressional oversight." The general's jaw tightened. "With respect, Senator, what constitutes illegal in matters of national security is not always clear-cut. The technology developed through Project Helix has provided critical advantages in contested airspace and prevented significant casualties in multiple engagements." "At the cost of 17 dead pilots," Margaret interjected coldly, "and 37 more who don't know they're on borrowed time." Outside the farmhouse, the situation grew more complex as a new helicopter approached, its markings indicating it carried additional Pentagon officials. Colonel Drake straightened as his radio crackled with new instructions. "Command actual. This is Sentinel. Raptor 1 is inbound with package Sierra. Secure inner perimeter for arrival." "Copy, Sentinel." Drake responded, professional despite his frustration. "Inner perimeter secured for Raptor 1. Within minutes, the helicopter touched down, and from it emerged a figure that caused immediate reaction among the military personnel. Secretary of Defense Howard Mitchell, accompanied by his senior staff. Drake met them at the landing zone, providing a hasty briefing as they moved toward the farmhouse. "Current status, Colonel?" the secretary asked crisply. "Intelligence Committee has been in closed session with the subjects for 93 minutes, sir. General Harrington and Director Chen are present. We've maintained security protocols as ordered, but media presence is growing and local population is increasingly agitated." "Containment assessment?" Drake hesitated. "Deteriorating, sir. The subjects have indicated intent to release classified material to media contacts if their demands aren't met. Deadline is approaching, and we have no contingency authorization. If they proceed," the secretary nodded grimly, "let's hope it doesn't come to that." Inside the farmhouse, the arrival of the Secretary of Defense added new tension to the already charged atmosphere. Margaret watched him enter with the calm assessment of someone who had anticipated this development, while Robert subtly repositioned himself to maintain line of sight with both the new arrivals and the neural interface device still sitting on the kitchen table. "Secretary Mitchell," Senator Whitman acknowledged, rising, "the committee didn't request your presence." "The President did, Senator," Mitchell replied, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Margaret. "Major Roberts, it's been a long time." "Not long enough, apparently," Margaret responded. "The last time we spoke, you were a deputy secretary, assuring me that Project Helix would be permanently terminated." "Circumstances change. Threats evolve. Our defensive capabilities must adapt accordingly." "How convenient that those adaptations align with defense contractor interests and military promotion pathways," Margaret observed. "While the human cost remains classified and buried." The secretary turned to address the congressional delegation. "Senators, I understand your concerns regarding oversight. I assure you the administration takes these allegations seriously. However, the approach being taken here, extortion through threatened release of classified information, cannot be the basis for policy decisions." "It's not extortion, Mr. Secretary," Robert interjected. "It's whistleblowing. After exhausting all internal remedies." Margaret checked her watch pointedly. 53 minutes until deadline. I suggest we focus on substance rather than legal. Semantics. The pressure in the room was palpable as competing interests and authorities navigated the unprecedented situation. Outside, media coverage intensified as word of the secretary's arrival spread. elevating what had begun as a local story about a crashed aircraft into national speculation about a major security incident. In Wilder Creek, the community's perception of events continued to evolve. Initial curiosity had given way to concern, then unease, and now a growing sense of pride that their unassuming neighbors might represent something extraordinary. "I always thought there was something different about Margaret," Evelyn Porter told, a reporter who had managed to find her at the church, where she was organizing an impromptu support gathering. Not in a suspicious way, just a depth to her, like she carried more than she showed. "They're good people," added Farmer Jim Henderson, standing nearby. "Whatever's happening up there, if Margaret and Robert are involved, I'd bet my farm they're on the right side of it." This emerging narrative of local heroes standing against government overreach complicated the military's position further. Colonel Drake received reports of growing civilian presence at the outer checkpoints, not hostile, but watchful. Local veterans had begun to appear, some in uniform items, creating an implicit challenge to heavy-handed intervention. Inside the mobile command center, contingency plans were quietly updated. Asset positioning was adjusted, extraction scenarios were prepared, though still requiring authorization at the highest levels. "If the deadline passes without resolution, sir?" Drake's executive officer asked quietly. "Then we follow orders," Drake replied, his expression revealing nothing of his personal assessment. "Whatever those orders are." In the farmhouse kitchen, the combined pressure of approaching deadline, escalating outside attention, and the presence of senior military and intelligence officials created an atmosphere of compressed intensity. Margaret maintained her center, the calm at the eye of the storm she had deliberately created. "You never should have continued the program," she said to Secretary Mitchell, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years of accumulated determination. "Those pilots deserved better. The 17 who died deserved better. And Lieutenant Sawyer, the young man I pulled from that wreckage last night, he deserves better." "The program continues because it's necessary," Mitchell countered. "The neural integration capabilities provide tactical advantages that cannot be achieved through conventional means. Every one of those pilots volunteered after being recruited as minors," Robert interjected, "before they could legally consent to experimental medical procedures with critical risk information withheld." Secretary Mitchell turned to Senator Whitman. "Senator, I'm prepared to authorize a full classified briefing for your committee. We can arrange secure transport to appropriate facilities where these concerns can be addressed through proper channels." "That's not going to happen," Margaret said before Whitman could respond. "We've spent 15 years ensuring this evidence wouldn't disappear into classified briefing rooms and redacted reports. 47 minutes until I make that call." The senior senator from California, a former prosecutor known for her incisive questioning, leaned forward. "Let's be absolutely clear about what we're discussing. You have evidence that the Department of Defense knowingly continued a program that was causing fatal neurological damage to personnel, concealed these effects from oversight committees, and recruited minors for experimental medical procedures without proper consent." "Yes," Margaret confirmed, "complete documentation on this drive, including internal memos acknowledging the fatal risk factors and explicitly discussing methods to prevent congressional awareness." The senator turned to Secretary Mitchell. "Is she telling the truth?" Mitchell's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "The situation is complex and, yes or no, Mr. Secretary?" the senator pressed. "Certain aspects of the program had unfortunate outcomes that were not fully reported," Mitchell conceded carefully. "But the strategic value of the technology justified. Nothing justifies killing our own pilots through experimental technology they didn't fully consent to," interrupted another senator, a former military officer whose son was currently serving. "Nothing." As the confrontation intensified, Director Chen, who had remained largely silent, moved subtly toward Margaret. Their eyes met in a moment of unspoken communication before Chen addressed the room. Perhaps there's a path forward that addresses both national security concerns and the ethical issues raised here, she suggested, her measured tone cutting through the tension. One that doesn't require making all technical specifications public, while still ensuring meaningful oversight and care for affected personnel. Margaret studied her former colleague carefully. "I'm listening, Kate, but the clock is still running." With 35 minutes remaining until Margaret's deadline, the atmosphere in the farmhouse kitchen had transformed from confrontational to grimly collaborative. Senator Whitman had taken informal control of the proceedings, directing questions with prosecutorial precision while an aide took detailed notes on a secure tablet. The evidence presented by Margaret and Robert, medical records, internal memos, budget allocations redirected from approved programs to classified extensions, built an increasingly damning case. "These neural degradation patterns," Robert explained, displaying comparative brain scans on his tablet, show identical progression across 17 pilots who eventually died. The same patterns are now appearing in Lieutenant Sawyer and based on the medical data I've been gathering in at least 23 other active Helix pilots. And there was no attempt to modify the interface design after these effects were documented? Senator Whitman asked. "On the contrary," Margaret replied, pulling up an internal memo from her files. "This communication from Project Director Aldridge acknowledges the degradation issue but explicitly states, and I quote, 'Performance advantages outweigh longevity concerns.' Current operational tempo suggests most pilots will achieve mission objectives within acceptable timeframes before significant impairment manifests." A stunned silence followed as the implications settled over the room. These weren't just technical failures being hidden from oversight. This was a calculated decision to sacrifice pilots' lives for tactical advantage. "Jesus Christ," murmured one of the senators, a former Navy officer. They knew they were killing them. Secretary Mitchell's expression remained carefully controlled, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his discomfort. That memo represents one director's assessment, not official policy. And it was written during a period of heightened tension with significant national security threats. "It's dated 14 months ago," Margaret countered flatly. "And it bears your initials approving continued funding." The revelation landed like a physical blow. All eyes turned to the Secretary of Defense, whose practiced composure finally cracked. "You don't understand the pressures we face," Mitchell said, his tone defensive. "The technological edge that neural interfaces provide is revolutionary. Our adversaries are developing similar capabilities. The strategic advantages—" "Don't you dare talk about strategic advantages," Margaret interrupted, her voice vibrating with 15 years of contained fury. "I had that technology in my head. I felt my own mind fragmenting piece by piece. I watched my squadron mates deteriorate until they couldn't recognize their own families, until they seized in their cockpits, until their brain stems literally short-circuited during high-G maneuvers." For the first time, raw emotion broke through her controlled exterior. "I held Captain Jessica Rivera's hand when she died," Secretary Mitchell. 26 years old, brain hemorrhage during a routine training flight. The last coherent thing she said to me was, "I can't remember my mother's face." The room fell silent. Even General Harrington, who had maintained military stoicism throughout, looked away. Outside the farmhouse, the situation continued to evolve. Local news coverage had spread Margaret and Robert's story, or at least the parts visible from beyond the military perimeter. Citizens from surrounding communities had begun arriving, parking along rural roads and gathering at checkpoints. Not protesting exactly, but present. A quiet demonstration of support for neighbors standing against perceived government overreach. Local veterans were particularly visible, some in partial uniform, forming an informal honor guard at the main road leading to the Collins farm. Their presence created an implicit challenge to any heavy-handed military response. "They're good people," Vietnam veteran Frank Potter told a local reporter. "Margaret brings homemade bread to the VFW meetings. Robert helped rebuild Joe Wilson's barn after that tornado. Whatever's happening up there, they've earned the benefit of the doubt from folks around here." In the mobile command center, Colonel Drake watched these developments with growing concern. The expanding media presence, the gathering community support, the arrival of high-level officials, all made tactical intervention increasingly problematic. His secure line buzzed with a priority communication from the Pentagon. "Colonel," came the voice of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. "What's your current assessment?" "Containment becoming more difficult by the minute, sir," Drake reported. "Media coverage increasing, civilian presence growing at checkpoints. Any direct action would now occur with multiple witnesses and cameras present." "Understood. Stand by for updated orders." Inside the farmhouse, Director Chen had taken a more active role in the discussions, positioning herself subtly between the military and intelligence representatives and the Congressional delegation. "I believe we can reach a resolution that addresses both the ethical concerns and national security implications," she suggested, looking directly at Margaret. "The technical specifications of the neural interfaces could remain classified to prevent adversarial acquisition, while the program's ethical violations and health impacts would be fully disclosed to appropriate oversight committees." "That's exactly the approach that failed 15 years ago," Margaret countered. "Partial disclosure, segmented information, classified barriers between related evidence. The result was 17 dead pilots and a program that continued under different code names with the same fatal flaws." She checked her watch. 28 minutes. "What exactly do you want?" Secretary Mitchell demanded, frustration breaking through his diplomatic veneer. "I told you from the beginning," Margaret replied evenly. "Justice for the dead, medical care for the living, full disclosure to oversight committees, and permanent termination of the neural interface program." "And how would you verify compliance?" General Harrington asked, speaking for the first time in nearly an hour. "If we agree to these terms, what prevents you from releasing the information anyway?" Robert exchanged glances with his wife before responding. "We've spent 15 years maintaining our cover and preserving this evidence precisely because we understand verification is essential. We're not interested in damaging national security or scoring political points. We want to save the lives of pilots currently serving and prevent more young recruits from being drawn into a program that will kill them." The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly as the generals and intelligence officials recognized the sincerity behind their position. These weren't opportunists seeking leverage for personal gain. They were professionals driven by ethical purpose and the protection of service members. Senator Whitman seized this moment of psychological transition. "I propose the following: an executive order immediately suspending all neural interface operations, emergency medical evaluation of all current and former program participants, establishment of a special Congressional oversight committee with full access to unredacted program documents, and immunity from prosecution for Major Roberts and Dr. Vance in exchange for their technical expertise in helping address the medical issues faced by affected pilots." The proposal hung in the air, a potential pathway through the impasse. Outside, the situation reached a critical inflection point as Robert's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. He checked it quickly, then showed the screen to Margaret. Her expression remained controlled, but Robert nodded almost imperceptibly to Director Chen. "There's something else you should know," Margaret said, addressing the room. "Lieutenant Sawyer, the pilot I pulled from that wreckage last night, has regained consciousness at the military medical facility where he was transported. and approximately 7 minutes ago, he began experiencing the neural cascade failure that precedes complete system collapse. She turned to Robert, who immediately began accessing medical files on his tablet. The emergency protocol we developed might stabilize him temporarily, but surgical extraction of the interface is the only permanent solution. How do you know he's experiencing cascade failure? General Harrington demanded. Because I've been monitoring him since he was transported, Robert replied, without looking up from his tablet. I embedded passive tracking diagnostics in all the pilot's interfaces, the same way we've been gathering data on the other 23 survivors for 15 years. This revelation triggered immediate reaction. Military officers reached for secure phones, urgent communications flew between the farmhouse and the Pentagon, and the Secretary of Defense consulted intensely with his staff. Margaret remained centered in the chaos, watching the reactions play out around her. When she spoke again, her voice cut through the noise with calm authority. This young man will die without immediate intervention. You have the lead designers of the neural interface system sitting in this room, offering to help save him. Meanwhile, you're debating political implications and classification levels. Her eyes swept the assembled officials. 22 minutes. The scale had finally tipped. Senator Whitman turned to Secretary Mitchell. I'm calling the President to recommend immediate acceptance of these terms. This committee will not allow another pilot to die while we debate bureaucratic semantics. Mitchell's expression tightened, but the political reality was inescapable. Between the evidence already presented, the gathering media attention, the support building in the local community, and now the immediate life-or-death situation with Lieutenant Sawyer, his position had become untenable. I'll speak with the President directly, he conceded. As Mitchell stepped outside to make a secure call, Margaret and Robert exchanged a look, weighted with 15 years of patient vigilance, finally approaching resolution. Their carefully constructed identities as simple farmers, the countless precautions, the meticulous documentation, all had been building toward this moment when the system would be forced to confront its own ethical failures. The interface extraction procedure will require specialized equipment, Robert informed General Harrington. I've maintained a surgical kit with the necessary tools, but we'll need immediate transport to the medical facility. You've maintained neurosurgical equipment on a farm in Iowa? Harrington asked incredulously. Along with everything else we might need when this day eventually came, Robert confirmed. We've had 15 years to prepare, General. Did you think we were just growing corn and hoping for the best? Outside, the community presence had grown further. Word had spread through local channels that Margaret Collins, the woman who made the best apple butter at the county fair, who volunteered at the elementary school reading program, who never missed a neighbor in need, had once been a decorated military pilot, now standing against government overreach. American flags appeared at the checkpoint gatherings. Local police, while maintaining order, positioned themselves symbolically alongside citizens rather than military personnel. Sheriff Hoskins, watching from his patrol car, shook his head in amazement. 15 years I've known Margaret and Robert. Ate Sunday dinner at their table at least 20 times. Never had a clue they were anything but farmers. Inside the command center, Colonel Drake received updated orders directly from the Pentagon. Immediate priority is stabilizing Lieutenant Sawyer. Provide transport for Dr. Vance and Major Roberts to medical facility. Authorization code Sierra Tango 97. Copy that, Drake acknowledged, already mobilizing resources. Transport team deploying now. The turning point had arrived not through confrontation, but through an immediate medical crisis that crystallized the human cost of the program in terms no amount of bureaucratic language could obscure. As Secretary Mitchell returned to the farmhouse, his expression revealed the outcome of his conversation with the President. A helicopter will transport Dr. Vance and Major Roberts to Lieutenant Sawyer immediately, he announced. The President has authorized emergency protocols to suspend all neural interface operations pending full investigation. And, he paused, clearly uncomfortable with this final concession, he's agreed in principle to the establishment of a special oversight committee with unrestricted access to program records. Margaret checked her watch one final time. 18 minutes to spare, she noted, then turned to Robert. Get your surgical kit. We have a pilot to save. As they prepared to depart, Senator Whitman approached Margaret. You've won this round, Major, she said quietly. But the fight for full accountability and program termination is just beginning. The resistance will be significant. I've spent 15 years farming in Iowa, Senator, Margaret replied with the faintest hint of a smile. I understand patience, persistence, and dealing with stubborn obstacles, and I won't be disappearing into the countryside again until this is finished. The helicopter landed in the field beside the farmhouse, its rotors whipping the autumn air into swirling eddies of fallen leaves and wheat chaff. As Margaret and Robert emerged from the house carrying specialized medical equipment, the gathered officials, soldiers, and distant community members witnessed something remarkable. The transformation complete from unassuming farmers to confident military specialists moving with purpose and authority toward a mission only they were uniquely qualified to complete. The couple who had sold jam at country fairs and attended church potlucks for 15 years walked toward the helicopter with the bearing of the elite military officers they had once been. And as they boarded, Margaret turned for one last look at the farmhouse that had been both their cover and their home. We'll be back, she said to Senator Whitman. This farm has protected us for 15 years. Now we're going to protect others. This military helicopter cut through the autumn sky, bearing Margaret and Robert toward Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, where Lieutenant Sawyer lay fighting for his life. Inside the aircraft, the couple had fully shed their farmer personas, moving with practiced efficiency as they prepared for the emergency procedure ahead. Robert reviewed surgical protocols on his tablet while Margaret established secure communications, with the medical team already attending the young pilot. His neural patterns show accelerating deterioration, Margaret explained to the flight surgeon accompanying them. The interface is triggering cascading misfires across his sensory cortex. Without intervention, he'll experience total synaptic collapse within approximately 3 hours. How can you be so certain of the progression? The surgeon asked, clearly skeptical despite her orders to cooperate. Robert looked up from his tablet. Because we've documented this exact pattern 17 times before. The neural interface creates distinctive degradation signatures. We've mapped the complete progression pathway. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. 20 minutes to Walter Reed. We've been cleared for priority landing. Back at the Collins farm, the situation continued to evolve rapidly. The remaining senators had moved to the mobile command center, establishing secure connections to Washington while maintaining direct oversight of the unfolding events. Intelligence officials began the process of formally documenting the evidence Margaret had presented, though the data drive itself remained secured with digital safeguards that only she could unlock remotely. Director Chen had stepped away from the main group, engaged in an intense private call that required signal-blocking protocols, unusual even for someone of her position. General Harrington observed this with professional interest, making mental notes about the apparent breakdown in standard chain of command. "You knew about them all along, didn't you?" Harrington asked when Chen returned. The Director of National Intelligence met his gaze steadily. "That would constitute a serious breach of protocol, General, one that would be difficult to prove given the classified nature of all related documentation." "That's not a denial, Kate." "No," she acknowledged quietly. "It's not." Their conversation was interrupted as Senator Whitman approached, tablet in hand. The President has just signed the executive order. All neural interface operations are suspended effective immediately. Extraction procedures are authorized for any pilot showing signs of neural degradation. That will be all of them, Chen noted. Based on the data Robert presented, every active interface will eventually trigger the cascade effect. It's just a matter of time. Whitman nodded grimly. The order includes provisions for immediate medical evaluation of all program participants, active and retired, with priority treatment at the government's expense. And the oversight implications? Harrington asked, professional enough to face the inevitable accountability. A special joint committee is being formed, Whitman confirmed. Unrestricted access to all Project Helix documentation across all iterations and code names, full subpoena power, and, she paused, understanding the impact of her next words, a presidential directive that no aspect of the investigation can be classified to prevent public disclosure of ethical violations or illegal activities. The scope of the intervention was unprecedented. A direct executive action bypassing traditional military chain of command and intelligence community classification privileges. What had begun as a crashed aircraft in an Iowa wheat field had triggered a fundamental realignment of oversight authorities. While military and congressional officials worked to implement the presidential directives, local and national media coverage intensified. The basic outlines of the story had begun to emerge. A decorated military pilot and medical researcher had gone into hiding for 15 years after discovering ethical violations in a classified program, only to have their cover blown when an experimental aircraft crashed on their farm. Outside the military perimeter, Sheriff Hoskins found himself managing an impromptu community gathering that had taken on the characteristics of both a support rally and a family reunion. Neighbors had brought food and folding chairs, setting up an informal vigil near the checkpoint. American flags mingled with hand-drawn signs expressing support for the Collins family. I still can't believe it was Margaret who pulled that pilot out and saved his life, Evelyn Porter said, distributing coffee from a large thermos, though I guess it makes sense now why she was always so good at organizing the disaster relief committee. The woman could evacuate half the county with nothing but a clipboard and a stern look. Robert stitched up my arm last year when I caught it in the combine, added Farmer Jim Henderson. Did it right there in his kitchen. Neater job than the hospital would have done. Guess now we know why. The community's response, pride rather than betrayal at having had covert military specialists living among them, presented an unexpected narrative that further complicated government efforts to control the situation. These weren't shadowy operatives in the public imagination, but valued community members whose specialized skills had quietly benefited their neighbors for years. At Walter Reed, the helicopter touched down on the medical center's roof, where a team of neurosurgeons and specialists awaited. Margaret and Robert were immediately escorted to a secure medical unit that had been hastily converted to accommodate the classified nature of Lieutenant Sawyer's condition. Armed guards stood at attention as they entered, though the lines of authority had blurred. Were they protecting the pilot from intrusion or monitoring the two whistleblowers who had forced presidential intervention? Lieutenant Sawyer lay in a specialized medical pod surrounded by monitoring equipment, displaying increasingly erratic neural patterns. Despite his youth, Margaret now realized he couldn't be more than 24. His features showed the distinctive tension patterns of someone experiencing neural interface degradation, the slight facial tic, the pupillary fluctuations, the random muscle contractions in his hands, all matched the progression she had witnessed 17 times before. "We've kept him sedated," explained the lead physician, "but the interface continues to activate erratically. Standard protocols have been ineffective." "They would be," Robert replied, already washing his hands in preparation. The interface is designed to remain operational even during unconsciousness. That's what makes it both valuable and ultimately fatal. As Margaret approached the bedside, Lieutenant Sawyer's eyes flickered open momentarily. Recognition dawned on his face, not of Margaret personally, but of something about her. "You're like me," he whispered, the words slurred but distinct. "You hear it too." Margaret nodded, taking his hand in a gesture that transcended professional distance. "I do. We're going to make it stop, Lieutenant. We're going to get it out of your head." The whispers, getting louder. His eyes unfocused again as another wave of interface interference disrupted his neural patterns. Robert had already begun preparing the specialized extraction equipment they had brought from Iowa. "We need to move quickly." His patterns show pre-terminal acceleration. The medical team watched with a mixture of professional interest and moral unease as Robert and Margaret worked with practiced coordination, setting up equipment that existed nowhere in standard medical inventories. The surgical apparatus they assembled included components that integrated with the neural interface's own technology, fighting fire with fire, using the interface's access points against itself. The key is creating a controlled shutdown sequence, Margaret explained to the observing surgeons as Robert positioned the extraction equipment. Direct removal triggers catastrophic feedback. You have to speak to it in its own language, convince it to release its integration points sequentially. "You're talking about the interface as if it's sentient," noted the lead neurosurgeon skeptically. "Not sentient," Robert corrected, calibrating delicate instruments, "but adaptive. It's designed to integrate with neural pathways, strengthen connections that support operational performance, create redundancies to maintain function during combat. Stress. That adaptation becomes its fatal flaw. It can't distinguish between enhancement and overload." As they worked, a secure call came through from the White House Situation Room. Senator Whitman's voice filled the operating theater. Broadcast. On speakerphone. "Major Roberts, Dr. Vance, the President has authorized me to inform you that all active Helix pilots have been grounded. Medical teams are being dispatched to evaluation centers. Your immunity is confirmed by executive order, and your status as technical consultants on the extraction procedures has been formalized." Margaret acknowledged this without looking up from her work. "Thank you, Senator. We'll need complete neural mapping data for all affected pilots forwarded to this facility immediately. Each interface adapts uniquely to its host brain. The extraction parameters must be individually calibrated." "Understood. Resources are being allocated accordingly." As the call ended, Robert completed the final calibrations on the extraction equipment. "We're ready. Beginning interface disconnection sequence." For the next 2 hours, Margaret and Robert conducted a procedure that existed in no medical textbook, guiding specialized instruments through the delicate process of disengaging the neural interface from Lieutenant Sawyer's brain without triggering the catastrophic feedback that had killed 17 of their former colleagues. They worked with the focused intensity of combat veterans, methodically addressing each integration point while constantly monitoring for signs of rejection or cascade failure. The observing medical team watched in stunned silence as these supposed farmers performed neurosurgical procedures at a level of expertise that surpassed most specialists. Their movements were perfectly coordinated, their communication often nonverbal, the product of years working together in high-pressure environments. "Disengaging frontal lobe connections," Robert announced, manipulating controls with microscopic precision. 70% complete. Margaret monitored neural patterns on a specialized display. Temporal stability holding, some resistance at junction points delta and epsilon. Compensating, adjusting extraction vector by 0.3 micrometers. The procedure continued with this technical precision, a dance of expertise and specialized knowledge that made it clear why the highest levels of government had authorized their immediate involvement. These weren't just whistleblowers with an ethical objection. They were perhaps the only people alive with both the technical understanding and practical experience to save the young pilots affected by the technology they had helped create. Outside the operating theater, the events at the Collins farm had triggered a chain reaction through military and intelligence hierarchies. Officers associated with Project Helix were being identified and contained. Secure facilities were being locked down for evidence preservation. Classification reviews were underway to determine what could be publicly disclosed and what genuinely required protection for national security rather than embarrassment mitigation. At the Pentagon, emergency meetings had been convened as military leadership grappled with the implications of the presidential directive. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs addressed the assembled officers with grim determination. This situation is unprecedented, but clear. We have a direct order to provide full disclosure regarding Project Helix and all related technologies. This is not optional, and it is not subject to classification exceptions. Any officer found concealing relevant information will face immediate court-martial. The chairman paused, his expression hardening. More importantly, we have 36 young pilots with potentially fatal neural technology in their brains. Whatever administrative fallout occurs, whatever careers end, whatever budgets are cut, our primary mission is saving those pilots. Is that understood? The response was a unanimous, "Yes, sir." Back in the operating theater, Robert carefully extracted a metallic device approximately the size of a quarter from an access port in Lieutenant Sawyer's skull. The neural interface, cause of so much suffering and the catalyst for their 15-year mission, gleamed under the surgical lights, its microscopic connections still pulsing with faint electrical activity. "Interface extracted," Robert announced, placing the device in a specialized containment unit. "Beginning neural stabilization protocol." Margaret watched the monitors, tracking the pilot's brain function as the foreign technology was finally removed. Neural patterns stabilizing, shock response minimal. It worked. The lead neurosurgeon stepped forward, examining the readings with professional amazement. "His patterns are normalizing rapidly. How is that possible? The level of integration should have caused significant trauma during removal." "The brain has remarkable plasticity," Margaret explained, her tone softening, now that the critical moment had passed. "Once the interface is properly disengaged, natural neural pathways begin to re-establish themselves. He'll need rehabilitation, cognitive therapy, possibly some memory reconstruction, but he'll live." As the medical team completed the final steps of the procedure, Margaret stepped back, the full weight of the moment washing over her. 15 years of patient waiting, of maintaining their cover identities while gathering evidence, of monitoring surviving pilots from afar, all culminating in this successful extraction that proved what she and Robert had argued from the beginning. The interfaces could be removed. The pilots could be saved, if only the program had prioritized their lives over technological advancement. Lieutenant Sawyer's vital signs continued to strengthen, his neural patterns gradually returning to normal parameters. The first pilot saved, with 36 more waiting for the same procedure. Robert joined Margaret at the observation window, their reflection showing two people who no longer resembled Iowa farmers in any way. Their posture, their focused expressions, their hands still moving with the controlled precision of their former professions. These were the elite military specialists they had always been beneath their carefully constructed cover. "One down," Robert said quietly. 36 to go, Margaret finished, and then the real work begins. Outside the medical center, the story continued to spread through official and unofficial channels. What had begun as a crashed aircraft in an Iowa wheat field had escalated into a presidential intervention, a major military accountability investigation, and now a medical rescue operation for dozens of affected pilots. The fighter jets that had circled the Collins farm that morning had been replaced by medical evacuation flights, carrying Helix pilots to specialized treatment centers. The military perimeter established to contain a potential security breach had evolved into a coordination center for one of the largest specialized medical responses in recent military history. And at the center of it all stood Margaret and Robert, the farmer and his wife, who had emerged from 15 years of patient obscurity to force a reckoning that would reshape military oversight and save the lives of pilots whom the system had failed to protect. 3 days after the successful extraction of Lieutenant Sawyer's neural interface, Margaret and Robert Collins stood before the assembled members of the Senate Intelligence Committee in a secure hearing room deep beneath the Capitol. The room had been swept for surveillance devices multiple times, and only those with the highest security clearances were permitted to attend. Even within these constraints, the audience was substantial: military officers, intelligence officials, medical specialists, ethics committee representatives, and legal counsel for all parties. Margaret no longer wore the practical clothing of an Iowa farmer. She was dressed in a tailored navy suit that suggested professional authority without military affiliation. Robert similarly had abandoned his rural wardrobe for the clinical precision of medical formal wear, complete with his original credentials. Displayed on a lanyard, Dr. Robert Vance, MD, PhD, neuroscience and military medicine. Together, they presented a stark visual contrast to the image that Wilder Creek residents had known for 15 years. Senator Whitman called the session to order, her voice carrying the gravity appropriate to unprecedented circumstances. This special joint session of the Senate Intelligence and Armed Services Committees will now come to order. Before we begin formal proceedings, I want to emphasize that by presidential directive, nothing presented in this room can be classified to prevent disclosure of ethical violations or illegal activities. Technical specifications with legitimate national security implications may be protected, but not the human impact or chain of responsibility. She turned toward Margaret and Robert. Major Sarah Roberts and Dr. Robert Vance, you have been formally granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for your complete testimony regarding Project Helix and your activities since disappearing in 2008. Would you please state for the record your true identities and former positions? Margaret stepped forward, her posture embodying the military bearing she had suppressed for 15 years. I am Major Sarah Roberts, formerly lead test pilot for Project Helix, United States Air Force Special Operations Command. From 2004 to 2008, I participated in experimental flight operations utilizing neural interface technology. I was the first successful recipient of a first-generation interface and the only pilot from that initial cohort who survived beyond 3 years post-implantation. Robert followed with equal precision. I am Dr. Robert Vance, formerly Chief Medical Ethics Officer and Neurosurgical Consultant for Project Helix. I supervised medical protocols for interface implantation and monitoring from 2003 until my resignation. In protest in 2008, I personally documented the fatal neural deterioration in 17 test subjects and presented those findings to program leadership before my departure. The formality of these statements belied the extraordinary nature of what followed, a methodical, detailed revelation of one of the most classified and ethically compromised military programs in recent history. For the next 3 hours, Margaret and Robert alternated in presenting evidence, explaining technical specifications, and documenting the human cost of the neural interface program. The technology was revolutionary, Margaret explained, using a specialized secure tablet to display schematics. The interface created a direct neural connection between pilot and aircraft, reducing reaction times from milliseconds to microseconds. It allowed for aircraft control through thought rather than physical movement. In combat scenarios, this provided decisive tactical advantages. She paused, her expression darkening. What wasn't fully disclosed to test pilots was that the interface doesn't merely read neural signals, it modifies them. It strengthens certain neural pathways while suppressing others. It prioritizes reflexes over reflection, tactical assessment over ethical consideration. It literally rewires the human brain to optimize for combat performance. Robert continued the technical explanation. The first-generation interfaces produced impressive initial results, but neural degradation began within months. Pilots experienced memory loss, emotional dysregulation, sensory processing issues, and eventually catastrophic neural cascade failure, essentially an electrical storm that overwhelms the brain's regulatory functions. He displayed medical imagery that caused several committee members to visibly flinch. Despite documenting these effects and recommending immediate program suspension, leadership chose to continue, focusing on developing more stable second-generation interfaces. When 17 pilots died, they were classified as training accidents or attributed to unrelated medical conditions. Margaret picked up the narrative. In 2008, after presenting comprehensive evidence to the Inspector General and receiving no meaningful response, I agreed to testify before a classified congressional hearing. My testimony was subsequently buried under national security classifications. 2 pilots who had agreed to support my claims died in suspicious circumstances within weeks. She met Senator Whitman's gaze directly. At that point, Dr. Vance and I concluded that traditional whistleblower channels had been compromised. We made the decision to disappear, preserve the evidence, and wait for an opportunity when the truth could no longer be suppressed. And how exactly did you accomplish this disappearance? Asked the ranking military member on the committee. For the first time, Margaret glanced toward Director Chen, who sat impassively at the side of the room. We had limited but crucial assistance. My neural interface was surgically removed by a trusted medical colleague. We created new identities using techniques I had learned in special operations training. We purchased the farm in Iowa with funds I had legitimately saved during my years of hazardous duty pay. And you chose farming as your cover because, prompted another senator, remote location, self-sufficiency, limited documentation requirements, minimal interaction with federal systems, Margaret replied with methodical precision. Additionally, the property provided secure storage for our evidence and medical equipment we would eventually need for interface extractions. What followed was the most extraordinary aspect of their testimony. The detailed explanation of how they had maintained surveillance on Project Helix for 15 years, while appearing to be nothing more than Midwestern farmers. Each neural interface contains a unique transmission signature, Robert explained. As the program's former medical director, I had established monitoring protocols that continued to function after our departure. The interfaces are designed to send diagnostic data to secure servers. We simply created a secondary pathway for that data, allowing us to monitor the neural health of every pilot in the program without detection. From our farmhouse? Asked an incredulous committee member. From a specialized communications facility we constructed beneath the property, Margaret confirmed. The technical specifications for that facility should remain classified, but its existence and purpose are relevant to these proceedings. The revelation landed like a thunderbolt in the room. These weren't simply whistleblowers who had fled. With evidence, They had established what amounted to an unauthorized medical monitoring station that had tracked classified military personnel for over a decade. "You maintain surveillance on active military pilots without authorization," stated General Harrington, speaking for the first time. "That constitutes medical monitoring of patients for whom I had established a doctor-patient relationship," Robert interrupted firmly. "Patients who were experiencing potentially fatal side effects from an experimental procedure I had helped develop. My Hippocratic oath didn't become void because the Pentagon decided to classify their suffering." The ethical framework thus established shifted the conversation from potential espionage to medical ethics and responsibility. It was a subtle but crucial distinction that Margaret and Robert had clearly prepared for extensively. Senator Whitman redirected the discussion. "Let's focus on the present situation. Lieutenant Sawyer's successful interface extraction has established that affected pilots can be saved. What's the status of the remaining active pilots?" 8 have already undergone successful extraction. "Procedures," Robert reported. 27 remain scheduled over the next 2 weeks, prioritized by severity of neural degradation. Our prognosis is positive for full recovery in approximately 60% of cases, with varying degrees of neurological impact in the remainder. "And the program itself?" asked another committee member. Margaret's expression remained controlled, but her voice carried the weight of 15 years' determination. "This is where mere suspension is insufficient. The neural interface technology is too tempting from a military perspective. The tactical advantages are undeniable. Without permanent, verifiable prohibition, it will simply be renamed, relocated, and continued under deeper classification. You're asking us to permanently abandon a technology that provides significant combat advantages," General Harrington countered. "In a world where our adversaries are developing similar capabilities, that's a difficult position to justify." "With respect, General," Margaret replied, "that's precisely why this committee needs to hear the full truth about what these interfaces do to the human brain. This isn't just about physical harm. It's about fundamental changes to cognition, decision-making, and moral reasoning." She stood and moved to the evidence table, retrieving a specialized storage container. Opening it with a series of precise movements, she revealed the neural interface that had been extracted from Lieutenant Sawyer. "This device doesn't just enhance pilot performance," she stated, her voice taking on an intensity that filled the room. "It progressively overrides human judgment with algorithmic decision-making. It prioritizes mission objectives over ethical constraints. In simple terms, it gradually transforms human pilots into computational weapons platforms." The bluntness of this assessment sent a visible ripple through the assembled officials. "Major Roberts," Senator Whitman said carefully, "are you suggesting that the neural interfaces affect more than just physical neural functions? That they impact moral reasoning?" "I'm not suggesting it, Senator. I'm stating it as documented fact." Margaret nodded to Robert, who displayed a series of comparative brain scans on the main screen. "These images show activity in the prefrontal cortex and limbic system, areas associated with ethical decision-making and emotional processing, before implantation and at 6-month intervals thereafter. The progressive suppression of activity in these regions correlates directly with psychological evaluations, showing decreased empathy, reduced moral concern, and increased willingness to accept civilian casualties to accomplish mission objectives." She looked directly at General Harrington. "This isn't a side effect, General. It's a design feature. The interfaces were specifically engineered to reduce the human factors that military planners identified as limitations in combat performance: hesitation, ethical consideration, emotional response to collateral damage." The room fell silent as the full implications of this revelation settled over the assembled officials. This wasn't merely a medical ethics violation or a case of concealed side effects. If Margaret's assessment was accurate, Project Helix represented a deliberate attempt to modify the moral architecture of human pilots, to create what one committee member quietly termed algorithmic soldiers. "Can you verify this claim?" Senator Whitman asked Robert. "I can," he confirmed gravely. The second-generation interface specifications explicitly included neural pathway modification parameters targeting regions associated with ethical processing. The clinical term used in program documentation was optimization of decision latency in high-stakes environments, but the functional result was suppression of moral consideration during combat operations. Margaret reclaimed the floor, her voice steady but intense. "I was the first test subject to recognize what was happening to my own mind. During a simulated operation, I approved a strike on a target with projected civilian casualties that I had rejected in previous scenarios. My post-mission psychological evaluation showed no emotional response to this change. I felt nothing about a decision that would have resulted in civilian deaths." She paused, allowing the weight of this personal testimony to register. "That was my breaking point. The realization that the interface wasn't just enhancing my abilities. It was fundamentally changing who I was as a human being and as an officer sworn to uphold certain principles." The revelation transcended traditional whistleblowing about safety concerns or program mismanagement. Margaret and Robert had exposed something that struck at the heart of military ethics and human autonomy. A technology that not only endangered its users physically, but compromised the moral framework essential to lawful warfare. As the implications rippled through the hearing room, Margaret delivered her final statement with the quiet authority of someone who had sacrificed 15 years to this moment of truth. "Senators, generals, distinguished committee members, the neural interface technology must be permanently prohibited, not just because it kills pilots, but because it kills something essential in them before they die. It transforms human beings with moral agency into weapons platforms executing algorithmic decisions. No tactical advantage justifies that fundamental compromise of what it means to be human." The room remained silent for several moments after she finished. Then Senator Whitman spoke with quiet resolve. "I believe we've heard enough to understand that this goes beyond medical ethics violations or program mismanagement. Major Roberts, Dr. Vance, you've done this country a service that transcends any breach of protocol or classification involved in your actions." She turned to the assembled military and intelligence leadership. "This committee will be recommending permanent prohibition of neural interface technology as currently designed, with ongoing oversight of any related research. We will also be establishing a special medical trust for affected pilots and the families of those who died." As the formal hearing concluded and committee members began to disperse, Director Chen approached Margaret and Robert. The three stepped aside for a private conversation away from the recording devices that had documented the official proceedings. 15 years, Chen said quietly. "When I helped remove your interface and create your exit strategy, I never imagined you'd live undercover for so long." "It was the only way," Margaret replied. "The program was too protected, too valuable to those who championed it. We needed absolute proof and the perfect moment to reveal it." "And now?" Chen asked. Robert smiled faintly. "Now we have 35 pilots who need ongoing neurological care from someone who understands exactly what was done to them. Our work is just beginning." As they prepared to leave the secure hearing room, Margaret paused at the doorway, looking back at the chamber where 15 years of patient vigilance had finally culminated in the full revelation of truth. Farmer Collins and his wife are officially Retired, she said to Chen. Major Roberts and Dr. Vance have patients waiting. 1 month after the Senate hearings, Margaret and Robert returned briefly to their farm in Wilder Creek. The community welcomed them with a potluck dinner at the local church, not as strangers or impostors, but as heroes who had lived among them. We never lied about who we were, Margaret told the gathered neighbors. We just couldn't share everything. The full story emerged through carefully declassified documents. How brilliant pilot Sarah Roberts had volunteered for an experimental program promising revolutionary aviation capabilities. How Dr. Robert Vance had joined to ensure ethical protocols were followed. How both had discovered the horrifying truth that the technology was killing pilots while overriding their moral judgment. Most poignant was the revelation of how they met. Margaret as test subject, Robert as monitoring physician, and how their professional concern had evolved into respect, then love, then partnership in a desperate mission to save lives and preserve humanity. And what happened here wasn't just a cover story, Robert explained, his arm around Margaret's shoulders. This farm, this community, it became our real life while we waited for the moment when we could save those pilots. And now? Asked Sheriff Hoskins. Margaret smiled. Now we have 35 patients who need us, but we'll be back. This will always be home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.